For the average person partaking in the substance of modern video games, that the dealers being big name publishers are selling at quality as mid as early Schedule 1 drug supply, it takes a lot for these people to hold and look at a game in store, or more realistically hover over that game in the online marketplace without a clue as to what your PayPal password even is, and then purchase that title without any further research, or especially at whatever full retail price that it's listed under, as that definition seems to get a new patch update every year now, but you just don't ever really see it or even likely do it all that often. Because there are just so many factors at play to determine what is an actual good game for your money or not. And when it comes to dropping the Ace Attorney jury verdict of what the value of a title is, one of the factors that players generally use as a measurement in this calculation is a game's graphic capabilities, or the level of detail in the video game's appearance and how well it implements them, accounting for all the different types of styles you might see in a game world. You see, over time, game graphics have grown relatively fast throughout the generations as the technology has advanced so quickly, so naturally, in between each major release that defined the consoles that they pertain to, there was just no way you couldn't ponder a future where the next, big game of that defining franchise just didn't look even more better or more realistic graphically speaking in the future. Like with every early Tomb Raider game that came out, if the next title cover had Lara Croft with more polygons on those pokers, you knew you were in for a good time. But as graphics got better and better, and the conversation became more about how much more real-life looking video games could potentially get, it eventually became the bulk of that conversation, at least for a lot of big name titles in the last decade, I would say, because we have all these games that, don't get me wrong, look just spectacular. They look amazing. Da Vinci would likely faint, but a good number of them are just empty copy-pasted experiences that feel like developers wasted all their skill points in the wrong category. So much so that right now, more players than usual just don't give a shit about how a game even looks anymore, as long as it's fun, accessible, and hell, easy to know life with something like a game of Balatro or Factorio. Both modern release games that are extremely simple in their presentation compared to the bulk of what's releasing in the big budget industry, and more on par with older eras of graphic fidelity. And dude, it's not just a coincidence. Everywhere you look, another lower tier graphic game is popping up on your recommended feed from going viral among the gaming community, whether it's from a banger independently developer studio using lower tier graphic style as their budget, or especially of the actual retro games that we all likely have experiences with, because there's just been a newfound appreciation for the art of having a game being lower quality without your potato PC forcing that to be the case no matter what you want. Because you have to consider the really timeless aesthetic you have with different types of retro graphic titles that make them all the more appealing to gamers in a world where minute details the naked eye probably won't even be able to catch makes a pro console worth $200 more over retail, apparently. Because when we break down the separate eras of retro gaming appearances, we could go back as far as to the 8-bit or 16-bit very primal style of video games that really just itches the spot just right of that classic arcade feeling in somebody's gaming lifestyle that just isn't quite mainstream anymore, being the genres that are quite literally the building blocks of what gaming has become. Looking at the games that adopted this early format within the consoles, like, the Master System, the NES, like I said, the actual arcade machines you would have to go to the bar and play. Anytime you play these bit style games, you know you're in for a simple, just straightforward time where you know exactly what you're getting and the objective is likely not all that complicated. And I'm sure that this is all some players need when it comes to enjoying a game's art style, because there's nothing complex about seeing, understanding, and appreciating just big pixels on a screen. Not to mention, the somewhat lacking in the graphics department also allows for the imagination aspect of some players to run wild, especially in the fan art community, to interpret the art of the characters and designs in ways that they just want to come up with in their own heads, since The models usually don't have the most detail in that pixel art style, but I mean that's only to a certain extent, because the only thing you can interpret with a game like Atari ET is what you could have done with that time you wasted playing that shit. Admittedly though, even though 8-bit and 16-bit games will always be at a widespread love and definitely a staple for budget-friendly indie developer teams to use in modern games, it is much more limited compared to the next Sonic stage of game graphics, being those higher resolution 2D games, usually of the 32-bit nature and over. Now, when it comes to the advanced 2D games, these titles usually fall under the category of RPGs or, those early side-scrollers, since they usually benefit the most from this specific art style. They obviously carry the same simple tropes as the former lower bit-based games, but with way more variety in finding more in-depth gameplay experiences, and that's made apparent because most of the games that are popular with this form of art style are usually either remasters of those 16-bit games that came before them, or just games that take inspiration from those former games and are using it as the art style in the newer iteration. Because man, the later 2D games just love to take advantage of your optic stems by usually just having beautiful art and a wide color palette, since everything is right there in front of you, at least in that specific level, and some players can just almost instantly appreciate seeing so much being made out of an art style direction that is crafted almost in the same way as a masterpiece painting, with a canvas so little compared to the other forms of graphic capability. But when said canvas gets the added character buff of a new dimension in its gameplay engine, you then just get that classic style of games that have the most room for creating impactful game worlds, and ones that players think the most of when they need a good old hit of those retro graphics, being just the early 3D era of gaming. That long stretch of games that encompasses the N64 era all the way to, I would even say, like the early Wii era, like up to like 2008 maybe, is easily the most accessible style of graphics to go back to, since we're still technically within this era of gaming, all things considered, as realism in gaming damn near reaches a new form of freaking sentience. Like, legitimately speaking, I don't know anyone that I talk to that isn't somewhat giddy about the early days of low-res textures, minimal shading, edges on the character models that you could literally count with no problem. This was a golden time for gaming for a lot of people, as most of these titles just felt like a pure video game. I don't know how else to explain it. The best way that I think I can explain it is by saying that it felt like you were in a virtual world that felt as its own being, since it wasn't entirely based around extreme hyper-realistic settings, and basically you could just enjoy this world as its own thing and not as a player looking through hypercritical lenses as you would for a game maybe of like a modern open world title that's set in a real life city, and then you just go around comparing how the game matches up with its real life counterparts. Not saying that's a bad thing or even something that I don't do myself, because based on the hours I've logged in Grand Theft Auto 5, I know the streets of LA more than my own hometown. Generally speaking though, it just does not matter which old-gen graphic game you have and which one you prefer for its appearance. You could honestly summarize all of their impact under the umbrella of just being indicators of straightforward experiences that aren't visually demanding, but still carrying a personality that's rare to find in a lot of blended titles of the modern times. But it is kind of funny though, because even though we are talking about retro game graphics up to, like I said, the early 3D era of gaming, at this point we're so deep into the 3D timeline lore of this entire hobby that right now even the late 2000s, early 2010s could be considered retro gaming for some players, just because of how improved we've gotten from those early technology stages. I cannot act like I haven't seen this particular generation share the bulk of what's being looked back on graphic wise, because in the 7th console generation into, I would say, maybe the early 8th generation, we had all those over exaggerated shaders, usually a much more dramatic color filter within the games, bloom and lighting that made you feel like you got flashed with a damn EMP every second of sunlight. It just felt like the medium had reached its edgy teenagehood phase of life, which is kind of ironic because a lot of us were likely edgy teenagers around the time these games were coming out. I mean, Lollipop Chainsaw sold 1 million copies first year for a reason. I think it was just the peak of experimental games, and as such, developers, they tried to reflect that within the graphics of these titles as well, trying to implement these cutting-edge style presentations, but in a lot of cases were just hindered by the somewhat confusing hardware of that time as well. So even though some gamers refer to this period being a little bit weird and wacky to look back on specifically, some gamers just find this level of graphics being a sweet spot to enjoy a somewhat realistic capability style of gaming, but still on hardware that reminds you you're still in just a pure video game universe. Either that, or just the warm feeling you might have when playing these old titles once again, which I believe, that whole ideology just beautifully bow ties this entire discussion, because when it comes to the idea of nostalgia and how prevalent and likely is to most players who are even interested in these retro graphics in modern times right now, it just goes without saying that where you were or what you were doing around the time when these games first came out, likely when you were a kid playing them, has just so much to do with why you look at these games with rose-tinted shades on and just appreciate them so much more right now. And hell, if you were anything like me and played some games religiously as a kid, some game worlds were literally essential to your overall upbringing as a child. Because I don't know about you guys, but this wizard just loved the Wii Resort's Wuhu Island, as that was one of the first games that I just loved growing up, with its insane bright colors and overall just getaway feeling that it emitted so effortlessly. And now, just one of my favorite pastimes is every now and then going into a game world that emits this same type of feeling, early 3D era of gaming with bright colors and just existing in that world, games like Mario Sunshine, Go Vacation, all those just types of titles. And of course, I don't say any of this to down the modern graphics that keep on improving. Obviously, we all still want our games to look as good as they possibly can when they come out and make us feel fulfilled in those big game purchases that are just charging S-tier price tags. But with how relatively fast we got good looking games and how much we always wondered, how much better they could just look in the future and how much realistic they could get, it kinda took gaming to reach a point of almost mirroring real life for players to realize that retro graphics and good gameplay was the apex of fun this entire time. And that's all that I got for today, man. If you enjoyed, leave a like in the video, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next.